So I think I'll get started as we're admitting people from the waiting room. Welcome everyone to Batten Hour. For those of you who are Batten community members, you know what Batten Hour is. You know it's a weekly time every week that our community members come together to hear from outstanding leaders in the field of public policy. And we were really excited to be able to host that Batten Hour this semester fell on the occasion of International Women's Day. And special thanks to our professor and Miller Center colleague, David LeBlanc, for suggesting our featured guest today, which just worked out absolutely perfectly. And we're thrilled that we are joined today by Ann Richard and Sarah Petrin for what will be a really wonderful conversation between the two of them, followed by time for Q&A. We are also really excited that Batten's own Women in Policy student organization, spearheaded by the incomparable Catalina Perez, was interested in co-sponsoring this event with us. So after the conclusion of the interview between Ms. Richard and Ms. Petrin, we'll be having Q&A that Catalina and I will be moderating. But first, I'm going to turn it over to Catalina for our introductions of our very special guests. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Happy International Women's Day. I am really excited to introduce these two amazing women for our Batten Hour today. I had the chance to speak with them very briefly today for the Batten Takeover. So if you guys are interested in a little bit of a background and stories that they had to say, please look at the Instagram story. So Ann C. Richard, the James R. Schlesinger Distinguished Professor at the Miller Center, served as Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration in the Obama administration from 2012 to 2017. Previously, she was Vice President of Government Relations and Advocacy for the International Rescue Committee. Earlier in her career, she served in other senior positions at the State Department, at the Peace Corps headquarters, and the Office of Management and Budget. Since leaving government service in 2017, Ms. Richard has taught at Georgetown University's Walsh School for Foreign Service, served as the SOL M. Linowitz Visiting Professor of International Affairs at Hamilton College, and has a Fellow of Perry World House at the University of Pennsylvania. Ms. Richard is a graduate of Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and holds an MA degree in Public Policy Studies from the University of Chicago. Sarah Dawn Petrin is a humanitarian and an educator from Maine. Born in an African village during the season of drought, she's helped refugees since she was 15 years old, from responding to an active shooter in the capital of Washington, D.C., to being held hostage by a warlord in the Sahara Desert. She has borne witness to the radical acts of ordinary heroism that lead to global change. Sarah has worked in more than 20 countries with the UN and the Red Cross and is a founder of Protect the People. She is a voice of authority who advocates for people in need. She teaches on the protection of civilians and human security at U.S. Army Peacekeeping and Stability Operations Institute. Sarah has a master's degree from the Refugee Studies Center at Oxford University, lives between DC and Pennsylvania, where she enjoys running with her dog, Toby. So like I said earlier, thank you so much, you guys, for agreeing to do this Batten Hour. And on behalf of Women in Policy and everyone else at Batten, we welcome you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Catalina, and thank you, the Batten team, for hosting us today, and happy International Women's Day to everyone. Sarah Petrin is somebody I met when we were both advocates in Washington, D.C., speaking up on behalf of the vulnerable, the displaced, the poor around the world. And she really impressed me at the time, and we've stayed good friends ever since. So I was particularly impressed when she wrote a book. Her book, Bring Rain, is being launched this month. And one of the things I like about it is that it's like having a conversation with Sarah. It's not a heavy academic tome for those of you who are immersed in those right now. It's a break from that. And it's much more about a mentor talking to people who are interested in starting out in the international humanitarian field. So without further ado, Sarah, happy International Women's Day. Why don't we kick it off by you talking about why you chose to write this book?
Thanks so much, Anne. It's so great to see you. And thank you so much to everyone at the Batten School for hosting us today. I also just want to wish everyone a happy Women's Day as we celebrate the contributions of women all around the world. And as we think about refugee women and women affected by crises, we just remember them today and honor them. And this book really is, it's really a two-part book. Part of the book is sharing the stories of working in the field for so long, and sharing the stories of the people who impacted me in my journey. As we know that when you're writing professionally, you're writing reports and studies, and I just didn't have a place to share my stories. So after working for 20 years in the sector, I wanted to pass on the more personal side of what it is to do this work. And then the other aspect of the book is really helping to guide young people. And as you and I know, we probably get requests almost every day, maybe a little different during COVID, to have coffee with someone who's dying to go work internationally and really wants to work with refugees, or really wants to help women, or someone who just really wants to live a life of adventure and isn't sure within the field of public service or international relations where to go. So I also wrote this book for everyone who's ever asked me for a cup of coffee, so that I could give them this book beforehand, because it really has all the advice and guidance that I have to offer for a young person. And a lot of the stories focus on when I was younger in the work, you know, in the first 10 years, I would say, of my international service.
And why is it called Bring Rain? You have to explain that.
Yeah, so Bring Rain is from the village where I was born. As was mentioned in the introduction, I was born in a small village in East Africa. My parents were doing mission work at the time, and my mom was a nurse and my dad was a teacher. And I was born in a very remote village that didn't even have a road going in and out of it. You had to cross a drawbridge to get to it. And I was born in a season of drought, a very severe drought. In fact, when I go to Kenya and I say that I was born there, people try to guess my age based on saying that I was born during a very bad drought, because people still remember it. And when my mom delivered me at the hospital, she had an audience. The village chief and his wife and children and everyone came, and it was an event for the community, an event for her, but not as private as she might have liked. And when I came home from the hospital, they had a rain dance and a celebration and a prayer, really, that I would bring rain in this season of drought, that my life would be a good omen. And this story and the pictures of people having this rain dance really stuck with me my whole life, that I wanted to be a blessing to people, and I wanted to bring relief to people who were in need. And at that time, I didn't bring rain to the village. The drought persisted, but I was forever conscious of people who were looking for help, and who were in circumstances beyond their control.
Now, you didn't grow up in Africa. You grew up in Maine,
Yeah.
and you had a typical American childhood in Maine. And but you somehow managed to get back and do so at a time that was really early in your life. I mean, you were 15 years old when you really first became a humanitarian. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, as I said, this story, kind of the folklore of being born in a remote place, really stuck with me. And I really felt a responsibility once I got old enough to try to go back and to bring something to that area. And so when I was 15, I raised $2,000, which was a lot of money for me at the time, from family and friends. And I joined a group of young people that was building a school in Kisumu, which is the regional town closest to the village. Is you know, a more urban center there. But we were building the school. It was 1992. And one day, Somali refugees came and overtook the land where we were building the school. And this was a major humanitarian emergency. I mean, one minute we were laying the foundation of the school, And the next minute, the place was flooded with hundreds of refugees, and they were in very bad condition. And I was very surprised at what happened next. The Kenyan police brought huge dump trucks and began rounding them up and beating the refugees. And I was just shocked that they would be treated this way. But I was in Kenya when Dadaab refugee camp in northern Kenya first opened. And this was the beginning, and it was before US Marines went into Somalia with Black Hawk Down and all of that. So this really had a huge impact on my decision to work with refugees and to help vulnerable people affected by war.
So you had gone to help Kenyan school children, and you ended up witnessing a major refugee movement of Somali refugees.
Yes.
Now, another story that Catalina just referenced was that early in your career, you worked for Senator Olympia Snowe of Maine, and you worked for her in Washington, D.C. in the US Capitol. And you had a scary experience there in 1998, during which you stayed cool under fire, which is an important ability to have if you're going to work in crisis situations. Can you tell us about that briefly?
Yeah, thanks for asking about this. Bring Rain opens with a story of being in a shooting in the Capitol. And I didn't realize how timely this would be with the recent incident at the Capitol building. But the last time the Capitol building was attacked was in 1998 when I was a Senate staffer. And there was an unstable man who had stormed the Capitol. But at the time, I was giving a VIP tour to a bunch of journalists from Maine. And when the shooting started, we did not know how many shooters there were. We were in the crypt in the bottom foundation of the Capitol. And as soon as I heard a shot, I knew that we were under fire. And my immediate assumption was that it was a terrorist attack with multiple people that were entering the building. And so I immediately took as many members of my group as I could, and I sheltered them in the women's bathroom and barricaded the door with my body, and I would not let anyone out. And this ended up being a big deal because some of my journalists got separated from their families when people scattered in the crypt, but I would not let anyone out to go try to find anyone because I really knew that we were still in a very serious situation and we just had to stay put until we knew that it was clear. But then the next day I made the front page of the paper for keeping everyone calm under pressure, and the families did get to reunite. But it was a big moment also for me as a young person. So
January 6th insurrection at the Capitol must have brought back memories to you then of that time in 1998.
It did. I'll say that, it's really interesting how reactionary Washington can be. We all know that, in 1998, after the last shooting at the Capitol Visitor Center was constructed. And there was so much improvement to security, but no one could have ever imagined that there would be such a large number of people and Americans that would attack the Capitol. So it definitely brought back so many memories to me of how important it is to stay safe, even in our nation's capital. So your career has had several phases. So you were an overseas aid worker, you were an advocate in Washington, D.C., you were working for the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants when we met, and most recently working closely with the Army War College to teach members of the military about protection of civilians and participate in training for peacekeepers. Which of these jobs or roles has meant the most to you? Yeah, it's such a hard question to answer because I think that each job was important. And that's one of the lessons I want people to take away from the book, particularly young people, is that you don't have to wait until you have a big title or a lot of money or a lot of authority to make a difference in the world. Some of the stories in the book that mean the most to me happened when I was volunteering or I was working in a community and I wasn't necessarily on the job, but I was just readily available to help someone. And so I really want people to come away from this book thinking that they can help people, even if it's not their professional career track. But for me, what I've really done is every step of the way just tried to make a bigger difference. So when I was younger in my career, I just wanted to get out in the world and work in as many places as I could and have a global mindset, a global context. And then afterward, I really realized that, working in protection, we have to work with governments to ensure that people have their human rights, that they have the protections to stay safe from violence. And I also realized that there was a gap in what we were doing as a humanitarian community. And that gap was very physical, that people were suffering physical forms of violence and they needed physical protection. And this is when I started working with police and military on ways to physically protect people from violence, which is not as easy as it sounds. As we know, we can't give a bodyguard to every woman and girl or child or vulnerable person out there. So we really, we need a coming together of everyone in the operational environment to try to reduce the risk of violence.
I want to talk more about your overseas experience, but before doing that, I know that you responded to a disaster in the United States, that after Hurricane Katrina, you went down to Louisiana and the American South. Can you tell us a bit about that experience of responding to a crisis in your own country?
Yeah, thanks, Anne. This was a watershed moment in my life and in my career, because I had just served as a cross-border operations specialist in Afghanistan and Pakistan after September 11th, when I came back to the US. And when Hurricane Katrina hit Louisiana, I just knew how devastating this would be for that community. But within days, my boss got a call from the White House asking me to do an independent assessment of the displacement of people from New Orleans. And I was down in Louisiana in the very early days when there was still a lot of devastation. And I'll just never forget the first few days when I arrived, that I would see families of 5 people or more sleeping in cars in vacant lots that were flooded. I would have grown men come up to me fully naked, asking me where they could find clothes. And it was just overwhelming for me to see how desperate people were and how much need there was, but also how inequitable the response was. And I share some stories about that inequality and how much I really felt like the systemic racism in the United States had really made this disaster much worse for the people of Louisiana than it needed to be. And it was very eye-opening for me to see that in my own country.
So I know we have a map of the places you've worked that we're going to project at a logical point. And you've had some close calls working in dangerous areas. What advice do you give people starting out about working in dicey situations and protecting themselves?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that, because, one of the reasons I wrote Bring Rain is because every now and again, we see a story in the news about a young aid worker who gets held hostage. And there is a hostage story in my book too, which we'll save for those who read it. And I know how easy it is for people that have good intentions and want to work in unsafe places to get caught up in a situation where it is beyond their control. And I try to emphasize in the book that if you're going to go into a conflict or war zone, you also have to take personal responsibility for your safety. A lot of aid workers, talk the water cooler talk about whether their agency is good at security or prepared for security, and every agency should have a good security plan and good security training. But ultimately, if you're going into a conflict or a disaster, there's so many things that can happen that your agency can't control for you. So you have to be prepared. You have to do your homework and research the risks in your area, research the security incidents, talk to other aid workers and organizations before you go, and just really have a mindset of preparedness so that what you're facing when you get on the ground.
I have a few more questions I'm going to ask Sarah, but in the meantime, I hope those of you participating today are thinking of questions you'd like to ask her, and you can go ahead and start putting feeding questions to our team using the Q&A function. I don't even see the Q&A function on mine, so I'm a little worried about that, but I'm hopeful if you send in your questions, our team will be raising them to her in just a couple of minutes. Okay, so today is International Women's Day, Sarah. You've become a specialist in protecting women and girls caught up in crises. How did your own story of being affected by violence as a girl motivate you to help women and girls? And how do you carry out these responsibilities in a humanitarian operation? As you said in response to the last question, you can't assign a bodyguard to each women, girl, or vulnerable person in a crisis situation. Yet we know when societies go through upheaval or there's unrest or uprootedness, bad things can happen.
Exactly, and I'm so glad you said that. And as we know that sexual violence doesn't just affect women and girls, we know it also affects men and boys in different ways, and people who are gender nonconformists also face harassment and discrimination in various ways. But we also know the statistics, that 1 in 3 women worldwide will experience sexual violence. And domestically in the United States, that statistic is about 1 in 5 women. And as you mentioned, I'm not an exception to that statistic. Unfortunately, when I was a young girl, I was abused. And this was something that happened to me when I was very young. And as a result of the court case, I went into a mandated self-defense training program when I was only 9 years old. I wasn't even double digits, and every day after school, I was court mandated to go into self-defense training. And this training was exceptional. And I think it forever altered my personality because I became very assertive. And I also became one of those people who's always sticking up for the person who might be bullied or might become a victim of violence. But this also inspired me really in my career to be very bold and sometimes brazen, because when you know that violence is happening and you're trying to intervene to stop it, sometimes you have to go to a very high level of government or up the chain of command of the military. And this can be really uncomfortable to be that person who's pointing out that something bad is happening and that you have the power and authority to fix it when you're working with governments. So I think that even though I don't wish for anyone to be a victim of violence, I think that my experience helped me to recognize people who are afraid, and helped me also to believe that anyone can be empowered to be an agent of change, and that people who have experienced violence, they are the survivors in the world, and survivors have powerful stories, and they can really help us envision a better world. So I'm very much about empowering women and girls and men and boys and people that have been affected by violence, and not pitying them or feeling sorry for them, but really uplifting them so that they can also help others.
Sarah, an important part of your story is your faith. And, among aid workers, there are aid workers who feel strongly that religion is the cause of a lot of misery and war in this world. And there are others working for faith-based organizations who are motivated by their faith to do things and to be activists and to be humanitarians. So you devote a chapter of the book to the importance of your faith, and you also describe how you've been influenced by vivid dreams that you've had. How has your faith affected your choice of career? Can you share with us a bit about how you are attuned to dreams and what you seek to discover through your dreams?
Yeah, thanks for asking. And I think, this chapter on having faith faith in humanity was really important for me to include, although I recognize people who have no faith at all. But I really believe that all humanitarians have faith in humanity at a minimum, because you see all these bad things happening in the world, and you have to reconcile it, not only for the limitations of what you can or cannot do on any given day, but also in your soul, you have to wrestle, I think, with the fact that you're not going to be able to help everyone, and how do you manage this? And so for me, even when I was young in the work, I began having very vivid dreams that were, I think, indicative of the type of protection that I wish I could have provided to people. I talk about being in Afghanistan and Pakistan and having dreams that I was a bird, that I could fly back and forth across the border, and that I could count all the refugees and all the refugee camps, and that I could see all the needs in every household. And this is kind of ironic, because now we have drones and unmanned aerial vehicles that are unarmed that take all this surveillance data for agencies. But this was at a time when we didn't have that technology. But I wanted that visibility. I wanted to be able to see the big picture. And I also had dreams that it rained in Afghanistan. And that is one of the happier stories near the end of the book about rain, and how there was relief for the drought when I was working in Kandahar as well.
Before turning to the audience, let me ask you just a couple more questions. If you had a chance to do your career over again, what would you do differently, if anything? Do you have any regrets? And I also want to ask you to, share with us what specific practical advice you give to young people who approach you seeking that.
Yeah, both are really big questions. One thing I talk about in the book is that I didn't really climb a traditional ladder of success in my career. And you see this in the book at the front. There's kind of a guide to the different assignments and countries and different types of work that I did. But every job I had, people would tell me about how to be a climber. When I worked on Capitol Hill, people told me how to become a prominent government official. And when I worked in UN projects, people kept telling me how to up the grade and get more UN positioning and everything. But for me, I was very motivated by this idea of trying to solve problems and trying to make as big of a difference as I possibly could in the world. And so sometimes that changed, like you said, going from being in the field to being an advocate to now training armed forces. I haven't had just one type of humanitarian career. I've had multiple types of positions. And so if I have one regret, it might be that I don't fit in the hierarchy of the system. And once you reach a certain age, it is good to kind of go in and be part of a bigger institution and play more of a leadership role. And so one of the things I would say to young people is, if they have a very specific goal, to try to pursue that now. And I have one student at Messiah where I also teach. When I asked her what she wanted to do for her ideal job, she said she wanted to be Secretary General of the United Nations. And I was just so blown away by that answer. And I thought, you go, girl, and at the time it seemed wow, as an American, that's a big thing to aspire to. We know that there are usually not American Secretary Generals, but now we see there is a young woman who has a campaign to become Secretary General that's getting attention. So I would say, if you have a very specific goal, just be laser focused on it. But also don't be afraid to try new things, and when we try new things, they don't always work out. But while you're young and you have some flexibility and you have energy and spirit, Don't be afraid to go out there and try new things. And in the book, I really try to give very practical guidance and offer questions that people can ask themselves to try to figure out their unique role and what they should be going for. And I wrote this mainly for young people, but I've even found that people like yourself and more experienced and senior people in the field also appreciate those questions. Because every few years you have to ask yourself, well, what am I doing and where am I going? And a lot of that is motivated by our values and what kind of difference we want to make in the world. And that can shift over time.
All right, it's time to respond to questions if we have some from the folks who are listening to this. I should have directed you to put your questions in the chat. So it's not too late to do that. If you have questions for Sarah, just type them into the chat box. Jill?
Yes, we do have some questions, starting with a question from our dean, and who also offers that it's very wonderful to have Ms. Petrin join us today. And he is also grateful to your leadership and service and interviewing as well. His question is, in reflecting on her inspirational example of courage and kindness, really relates to how she maintains her hope and positivity despite all the horrors that she's witnessed around the world. And I know you did touch on your faith, but just even on a day-to-day basis, I think a lot of us are wondering what keeps you so optimistic and such a powerful voice of empowerment, given all the tragedies that you see, and also probably the recognition that it takes many, many people to make really big change.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ian, for that question. That's it is a really important question, and there's a story that I shared the other day with a friend. One of the most powerful examples in the book that's actually very short comes from when I was working in an Ebola clinic in Sierra Leone, and I was working with nurses and doctors on protective equipment, and we were trying to make sure that medical professionals didn't get infected themselves. But what was so strange about it was that we were also doing this in the maternity ward of the hospital. So you can imagine people are dying of Ebola, they're hemorrhaging, and next door we have women and young girls giving birth, and families outside the door that are celebrating and clapping and delighted to welcome their new family member, even in the midst of this terrible crisis of suffering and death and loss. So I think we see this all over the world. We see even in the war in Syria, sometimes beautiful wedding pictures of people that are continuing to live their lives, that are continuing to love one another. And there's always new life, even in the worst situations, like people dying of Ebola, we have people celebrating new life. And this is just part of embracing the complexity of the world. And I share another story in the book from this tsunami in Thailand, working with Burmese refugees who were putting on, a show for me to thank me for my work in their community. And at the same time, my attention was focused on a young person in the audience who was dying of HIV/AIDS. And so here the community was celebrating and appreciating me, but there were also people caring at the same time for people who were very close to losing their life. And this is just the way it is in the world. And maybe COVID has brought us closer to this reality of the fragility of human life, but you have to be able to embrace this if you are going to do humanitarian work.
Wow, thank you so much for that. We have another question from Erin Tor. She mentions that she previously worked as press director of the Peace Corps, and she often recommends it to any students who are interested in getting hands-on experience. And she mentions that, of course, Peace Corps, as you know, is serious 27-month commitment that isn't the right fit for everyone. So do either you or Anne have any recommendations of programs that young people might want to join who want to gain experience abroad, aside from the Peace Corps?
Anne, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, well, I had colleague at the State Department who had started his career as a Fulbright overseas, and he is a big believer that the Fulbright program is a fantastic U.S. asset for American youth, students, not young youth, because he says it can get you overseas, it can get you places where you're speaking the language and meeting people and connecting, and is, you know, quite a generous package. I think it's very competitive, but for Batten School students, I think it's definitely something worth looking at. I am a fan of the Peace Corps. In fact, I encouraged my daughter to join the Peace Corps. She was there for 3 weeks and then sent home because of the pandemic. So right now, Peace Corps is reevaluating how they're gonna field volunteers. So I think it's really going through a key moment. What she told me is a lot of the former volunteers are now discussing some of these issues that are so big in the aid community right now, related to patriarchy, related to colonialism, related to you know, the history of who you know, the best way to serve communities overseas. And that's a very lively debate right now among fans of the Peace Corps and returned Peace Corps volunteers. So I was not myself a volunteer. I worked at Peace Corps headquarters and I became a fan of the Peace Corps. I think learning languages is just so essential, especially for Americans, because it's harder for us in some ways than, say, for Europeans or people living in Southeast Asia or parts of Africa, where we're not exposed to other languages on a daily basis. You can easily go through your life speaking just English, and there are pockets in the US where you could, you know, survive quite nicely with just Spanish. But being able to speak more than one language is a real asset internationally. And so I made sure my kids learned another language, and they were able to pick up a third language now more easily because they learned French when they were kids. And so I think as frustrating, I have no patience for learning grammar and other languages, so that's not the best example, but I do know that even in places where I don't speak the language well, if I try, it just really breaks down a barrier, and it's so welcoming for people overseas to hear when an American tries to reach out to them. Sarah, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I do talk about Peace Corps in my book, and I hope that at some point I could do a talk for Peace Corps, because one thing that does concern me about the program is the risk to women and girls when they are put in remote environments. And I know a number of Peace Corps volunteers who have experienced violence or been really pressured to marry while they're in their voluntary service. So I encourage people, particularly young people and young women, to go to a more regional center. You don't have to go to a capital city, but go to somewhere where there's a town where you can access a phone line, where you can access the internet. Once you get to a very remote area and you're the only foreigner, it is more likely that something could happen to you there. And I think we have to recognize that risk, and we have to make it the program safer for women. And I have lots of ideas about that I'd be happy to talk about at another time. But I also think that a number of international organizations are opening up internships, and in French, they're called like a stage. So organizations in Geneva, the United Nations, they have some entry-level positions, both paid and unpaid. And I encourage people not to shy away from those entry-level positions, like UN volunteer programs and things like that. Just get your foot in the door. And of course, there's all kinds of volunteer service projects that you can go to that would give you some exposure to other cultures and customs that might help you discern whether you really actually want to live abroad and work abroad.
The US government sponsors some entry-level younger professionals to join UN agencies. It's called the JPO programs. I know they have junior professional officer. The downside is they're quite competitive. The upside is it's a great way to enter an organization like the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. Okay, Jill.
All right. Next up, we have a question from Bill from William Anthalis, the director and CEO of the Miller Center. He says, thank you for being here, and also is curious, given your experiences, particularly around health and previous epidemics, what are you thinking about the current COVID crisis in the international arena? How do you see the world changing as a result, especially for young professionals in thinking about opportunities to serve? You touched on that a little bit, but sort of more from the global standpoint.
Yeah, I think this is a really important question, and certainly we can do better within the United States of cooperating between the federal government and state agencies. I point this out in the Katrina chapter, that the failure for government leaders to coordinate at the city, state, regional, and federal level led to unnecessary suffering. And I think this is still the case. I think we in the United States, we always assume that our systems are going to work, and that when there is a disaster, that something will hold. Whereas oftentimes things really break down, like we saw the electric grid in Texas break down. In Superstorm Sandy, we saw housing breakdown for huge groups of people that were left homeless by that storm. So we have this sense of being invincible, that we really are not invincible when it comes to humanitarian crises, and especially major disasters that are weather and climate related. So I think within the US, we can do better with our FEMA emergency management system and making it more responsive and more inclusive, and working with communities. But when it comes to global health, and I always say with Ebola, we're kind of lucky in a way, and that seems like an awful thing to say, but with COVID, imagine if this really had been a form of bioterrorism, or if everyone who had contracted the virus was certain to die as a result. And I think we know that this capability exists, and certainly after working a little bit with in the defense world, you are aware of so many other risks. So I think that for people that are looking at global health and health security, we need people who understand the science of global health and can help us better prepare for other types of outbreaks, because I think we will see other things like this, and they probably will be worse than this particular virus. So I'm glad that we're starting to get vaccinated and people are going to come back together. But I think this is just a warning of the potential that could come if we don't take global health seriously.
I can add to that in a kind of a different angle, which is, and I think about this because of your mentioning Hurricane Sandy, Sarah. After Hurricane Sandy, it was yet another example of America, which is supposed to be the superpower that tells other countries how to organize themselves. America really having difficulty coping with such a damaging storm. And what we did in the Population, Refugees, and Migration Bureau was to come up with voluntary guidelines for countries to adopt of how to help migrants during a natural disaster like that. So these were the Migrants in Countries in Crisis initiative. And one of the main findings of our guidelines, one of the main recommended guidelines, was that in a crisis, people need help regardless of their legal status. So if you think of undocumented people in the New York State tri-state area there, where Hurricane Sandy came ashore in New Jersey and in New York on Long Island, it didn't matter whether you were a US citizen, a green card holder, or undocumented, you still needed help. And help should be provided then in more than one language. There has to be a lot of outreach to people in a crisis like that. And that was a recommendation that then ended up in these guidelines and was made to all countries and in responding to a crisis. And it also, it fits the current COVID crisis, is that you don't want to just inoculate your own citizens. You want to inoculate all the residents of your county, state, province, country.
I think if I can add one more comment, what Anne's remarks remind me of is a truth that I think we don't really appreciate, is that we need leaders at all levels of government. And this is super important for the Batten School and for students that are attracted to a place like the Batten School. We need people who are leaders at the city level, at the county level, at the community level, within the schools, within the healthcare system, within local government. And so often, we focus on leadership as being like, the president of the United States, or, an elected official who wins a good campaign. But really, you can step up to leadership in so many ways. We need student leaders like Catalina who are sticking up for women right there at UVA. This is an important role, and you don't have to wait till you graduate to do something great. You can do something great right now. And I think we have to tell that truth to people, because every day that we have is a day that we can make a difference in the lives of someone else.
Thanks so much, you guys. I have a question on behalf of Women in Policy. You guys kind of mentioned it a little bit, especially you, Sarah, having to do with how to get involved as a student. So a lot of times our members ask us, what are the best ways to get involved? I can't work over the summer for whatever reason. I would love to get involved right now while I'm in school. And what do you think the best way to do that would be? Just for the fellow students like me, I'm a little bit old, I'm leaving this year, but for the people who can still do something, what would you recommend?
Well, I would say volunteer in your community. You don't have to get on a plane and go far away to make a difference in the world. Right in your community, there are people in need. And one of the things that humanitarians are really good at, but we could actually do better at passing on to others, is having the power of observation and being able to see people in need and recognize them. And then not only see them and recognize them, but then take the next step to do something to help. And I think this is a power that everyone can have. Whether you're a student or a professional, you can volunteer in your community, you can see the needs, and you can just work to address them as best you can. And this is a contribution that if we had more people contributing like that, our communities would be better places to live.
A great thing about Charlottesville is it hosts an International Rescue Committee office that resettles refugees in the Charlottesville area. And they haven't been as busy as they have in the past because the numbers of refugees being resettled in the US was slashed during the Trump administration. But the Biden administration has very ambitious plans to bring lots of refugees in the coming couple of years. So if they do end up succeeding in a really sharp uptick of refugees coming to the United States, I think that the Charlottesville IRC office and other not-for-profits that resettle refugees all across the US will be looking for volunteers. And there's different ways to volunteer. One is to meet refugees at the airport, bring them to their apartments, help set up those apartments, help donate things to outfit those apartments. But I had a young woman who volunteered for IRC in the Washington, D.C. suburbs, in the Maryland suburbs. And she's now in medical school, but her specialty at the time was helping refugees who had a sick child get to their medical appointments. Because as we all know, that can be an overwhelming responsibility to help somebody navigate the U.S. Health system. So, so I think there's lots of ways to help locally. And I'm not suggesting you all flood the IRC office, but I think that's just an example of what might be in your own hometown or might be in a city where a relative's living and you could get to.
All right, I think we have time for about one to two. Oh, we have one more question. We have a question from our social equity advisor, Marissa Jones. Thank you for being here. Her question is, oh, this is a good one. On International Women's Day, what women have supported and inspired you on your career paths? For example, whether they're leaders, mentors, trailblazers, colleagues, family members, etc. That's a great question.
Well, I can say that Anne is one of the people that I admire, who's inspired me. And, you know, I've known her over the years and she's held so many great roles. And one of the best things about Anne is her personality. She's so fun and she can make even the toughest conversation sound like, you know, a great fun time. I don't know how she does it, but I've seen her do this in government. It's very impressive. So I really admire Anne. But I think really for all women, you know, the important thing for women is to support and encourage each other. And it can be competitive. You know, every field, once you specialize and you want to have a more senior role, gets competitive. So like we all know all the people who specialize in the same things as us, and we hope for the best for them, but sometimes we're competing with them for jobs. And so, you know, maintaining that spirit of openness and helping one another is super important. And there have been so many women in my life. I can't point them all out. There are just so many. I know my mom is even joining us today, so I should thank her on Women's Day for being a nurse and having compassion and caring spirit for others. That's inspired me. But there's so many. And maybe, Anne, you can think of one or two in your career also.
Sarah and I have a mutual admiration society, as you've probably been able to figure out. It's great. You know, she sees me as a mentor, but I see her as a real resource to educate me about things overseas. I'm very fortunate because one of my mentors is Madeleine Albright. And she has said many times that there's a special place in hell for women who, you know, climb the ladder of success and then kick the ladder out from behind them so that the next person can't get the same jobs and positions and responsibilities. And so I do feel a special responsibility to try to do this kind of conversation, help people start out, you know, because this is not like becoming a lawyer or becoming a doctor where the steps are very well defined. And I think that's partly why I was so happy that you took the time to write your book, Sarah, you're working in an area where you have to use a lot of judgment, and it's not, the guidebook is not written for how to advance in the field. And because you've done so many different things, I think it really is, you're a good person to talk to about what's possible, and you know, what motivates you, what to strive for, and what to look out for. So yeah, I've been very fortunate by having people like Madeleine Albright, Wendy Sherman as mentors, key parts in my career, but obviously you got to pay it forward.
We've got one more question that's sort of I guess it's related a little bit. What kind of advice would you tell some of us women who are the most unlikely to fit at any levels of society or hierarchy? What would be some advice, whether it's because of socioeconomic backgrounds, identity, whatever reason, someone who doesn't sort of fit the classical mold, what kind of advice would you give those women to help them bring the change or be the change that they want to see around them? Thank you for that question, Sarah. That's from one of our first-year graduate students.
I'll start so Sarah Petrin can have the last word. I have to say that when I first started out, I would sometimes be the only woman in a room. of people. It was because I was the token woman with a lot of men. And I think for other sort of categories of society now, it continues to have to be pioneers, people who step forward. And it's tough to do. You have to, Sarah talks about being assertive. I think you have to do that. You have to learn to speak up and to be kind of courageous sometimes in situations where that's not the most comfortable thing to do, is to speak up and challenge people and call attention to yourselves. I think even if you are the most unlikely to fit at any levels of society, you can still see something going wrong around you, even in the street, even as sitting in an audience. I mean, maybe it's because I'm a mother, but I was at an event a few years ago, and a guy approached the microphone and was asking a question, and one of his colleagues in school was making fun of him behind his back. And I just turned to that kid and said, knock it off. And, you know, I wasn't his mother, but I was like, you got to support the person at the microphone, you know, and you got to, you know, just stop people who are a negative force in the world, and really, you know, get behind and push forward people who have the courage to speak up. Sarah?
Yeah, this is such an important question, I think, because like right now I'm teaching on culture and racism and gender and inequality. And one thing I've been really thinking about is intersectionality and how we embrace everyone who feels that their sense of identity puts them at risk or makes them lesser than someone else. And I really think back to advice that I give in the book that is true for everyone, that you cannot operate as an individual in this world and succeed. You need other people. You have to have other people come around you. And when you have the support of friends and other professionals, and you build a network of people who believe in the same things that you do in terms of your vision, you will be more powerful together than you would be alone. And I know a lot of people that are introverts kind of struggle with this, but I reach out to people when I need help. And my friends know when I need something, and my professional colleagues know when I'm looking for a change in a job. And I reach out to them and I ask for their advice. And I really wouldn't have been able to do very much without this network of friends and colleagues. And so it doesn't matter where you live or who you are or how many boxes you feel that you may not tick for someone. You know, develop your network and link up with people who are like-minded in spirit. And don't be afraid to reach out to people for help or for advice. The worst thing they can say is no. And sometimes people don't take my call or don't take my email, but that's okay. Maybe the next person will. And so just keep trying and don't give up. Easier said than done, but it's a big key to success.
I think that brings us to our end. Thank you, Batten team, and thank you, Sarah, and much luck with your book, Bring Rain, which officially launches March 22nd, is that right?
Yes, the book is only available for pre-release through Tremendous Leadership Books. And so the Batten School will be getting a box of books this week. I'm so excited about that. You will be some of the first people to get a copy because it will not go on sale until March 22nd. And you can also go to my website, sarahpetrin.com, and sign up for other events that week. And I would love to talk with you more. So you can send me a message, stay in touch with me, and you'll also see more news about where you can find the book once the release is out.
So with Dean Rockwell currently unable to get onto the line, let me, on behalf of the Batten School as the Dean, thank you and invite my colleagues and students to join me in thanking Professor Richard and Sarah Petrin for this great conversation.
Thanks very much, Dean Solomon. Really appreciate it.